Mr. Speaker, the government knows that protecting the environment is about real changes that we make in our daily lives, such as recycling. And our government has shown leadership in this area in achieving many goals. And, Mr. Speaker, as the member for Queens and the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville have already noted, our government has achieved quite a number of goals, some worthy of mention again. The natural resource strategy, which is something that's very important in our area. Many of my constituents were very involved in that, and actually in the Colin Stewart Forest Forum, one of my dear friends, Paul Pross, was certainly a contributor to that document. The wetland conservation policy is something that's also very important, and it plays out in different ways. In my area, there's a cranberry farm called Terra Beata, and when you're starting to develop any sort of cranberry bog, if you're going to use land, then you need to create another bog in another place. And as a result of meeting with the people there, and Mr. Ernst and his wife were very ingenious people and have worked very hard to make their business a success, explained a lot about this act that really helped me understand how it works in practical terms. Some of the other things that we've already achieved are sewage treatment facilities meeting guidelines. In Mahone Bay, this is really quite significant. When you drive into my town, there's a little sign that says, "We love the beauty around us and we welcome you to share it." The good thing was that a number of years ago, you didn't say we welcome you to share the beauty and not the water, because our little bay had raw sewage going into the bay. And our town of less than 900 people worked very hard to get a sewage treatment plant together. We realized that through public consultation, a lot of people in the town weren't for that. It meant raising taxes to deal with it, but we went ahead, bit the bullet, and was one of the first small towns in our area to do such a thing. So now when we say we welcome you to share the beauty around us, we also welcome you to share the water in Mahone Bay. Some of the other achievements that our government has already, goals that our government has already achieved, we have met the worldwide standard for airborne fine particulate matter. Canadian-wide standard for ground-level ozone constituency has been met. Building Code Act, which includes energy efficiency for homes. In my area, there's one of the first green communities in Nova Scotia called Hawthorne Hill. And it is a hill, and there were many, many hawthorn trees on that hill, hence the name, and yet there's still lots of hawthorn trees there. But the development has gone into stage 2, which is building a new road, and all the houses that are there are environmentally using environmental guidelines, and people have come from all over the country to build their homes in this area and to live in the area. And we're very proud that our constituent Ian Startup, who started the project, is already in the successful stage 2 of that project. Mr. Speaker, as part of the EGSPA legislation requirements, a public review is needed every 5 years by a round table. Mr. Speaker, the round table is a voluntary board consisting of members from legal, academic, industrial, and environmental sectors who advise the Minister of Environment on environmental and sustainability issues. These people, when you look at the caliber and quality and breadth of this group, this round table, you can certainly understand that the kind of information that they will be bringing and sifting through would be of a very high caliber indeed. The public engagement is a very important part and key part of the EGSPA review. Mr. Speaker, over 70 participants attended the 5 public meetings that were held across the province, and there was great participation on the South Shore area. Over 80 written submissions were also received, and from all this, the roundtable were able to compile this information. The feedback that was provided by environmental groups, industry associations, municipalities, and members of the public all contributed to this report. Mi'kmaq organizations, both on and off reserve peoples, also provided input. And their unique look at a holistic vision of the world certainly gave another flavor to this review. This legislation on sustainable development has a broad support by stakeholders and this integrated approach is certainly what this Act strives for. The goal of the Act is to, quote, fully integrate environmental sustainability and economic prosperity, end quote. The consultations that were part of this review revealed a wide variety of approaches and perspectives to improve the ability of EGSPA to achieve this integration. The Roundtable's recommendations will guide EGSPA's success over the coming years, and some of their recommendations are as follows. They'll focus more on the integration of environmental goals and the economy. That one was highlighted and is really, really key, and it's what's informing a lot of our other strategies. Another of the recommendations was to ensure that EGSPA aligns with and helps fulfill the government's core priorities by increasing awareness of the Act within government. Another recommendation was increasing the accountability of departments to uphold the Act and providing mechanisms to encourage departments and sectors to pursue initiatives in accord with this legislation. Another recommendation was to include methods to evaluate and targets to adjust where necessary. And finally, to raise awareness and understanding and support of EGSPA among citizens of the province and communities in those sectors. Mr. Speaker, blending continued economic growth featuring sustainable prosperity is the core concept of our government's approach. Our Jobs Here strategy looks very closely at good environmental practices that can increase competitiveness for business and reduce cost. Innovative energy production and our renewable energy strategy will turn around our dependence on coal. This plan will take us to our 25% renewables by 2015 and 40% by 2020. As part of the strategy, our Premier announced an historic agreement between Newfoundland, Labrador and Nova Scotia will give us access to 35 years of stable, renewable energy for all Nova Scotians. Our communities are now becoming very engaged in ComFit programs. And Mr. Speaker, in my area, one of my constituents named Keith Taus has been working with First Nations and other groups to get a ComFit plan happening in our area. The planning stages are well underway, and it looks like some groundbreaking work will actually happen very, very soon. I've spoken to many groups who are impressed with our government's achievements with environmental areas and look forward to us achieving more in this area. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the things, the goals that are in progress. Legally, protect 12% of Nova Scotia's land by 2015. We're certainly well along that road to achieving that goal, and certainly a lot of Nova Scotians are very impressed with how we're doing that, even though some of the opposition called it buying dirt, but we know better. One of the other things about municipal public drinking water supplies to meet provincial standards of 2008, Mr. Speaker, in my town again of Mahone Bay, we just opened a few years ago our water treatment plant, and again for a very small town, not only do we have a state-of-the-art sewage treatment plant, but a water treatment plant, which we're very, very proud of. And 2 years ago, Lunenburg opened their water treatment plant, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Another goal that's in progress is primary treatment of watershed, of wastewater by 2017. We're reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 10% below the 1990 level by 2020. Reducing mercury emissions by 70% from 2001 levels by 2014. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot about this bill today. We've had a number of speakers talk about this, and I would like to say that the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, Bill 136, is moving our government and our province forward in many ways. And to quote our Minister of Agriculture, environment is a requirement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to join the debate because I was here when this act passed through the House, and it got the entire consent of the legislature, because we all know that sustainability for the province, sustainability and economic goals, when they are brought in harmony, is indeed a very, very good thing for our province. In fact, the last decade and a half, maybe longer, I know when I was starting my teaching career, the environment started to become a major topic of discussion. We go back to the 60s, and a book like Rachel Carson's book was, I guess, a watershed point in time where she brought in very stark, real terms what was happening in our environment. The many myriad ways in which it was under attack, and from that point onward, I know our school curriculum started to take a pretty strong look at how we could in fact find a balance, how we could continue economic prosperity, but also look after environmental needs, that ecological principles would in fact be part of the way in which we did good economic business. And I think over the past several decades, as some of the discussion here has been pointing out today, Nova Scotia has done a reasonably good job. And one of the hallmarks, of course, is the way in which we look after our waste. And we know that we go to not just other countries or states in the U.S., but many of our own provinces in Canada have a very, very weak effort in terms of recycling, reuse, with our garbage, with the things we discard. We've brought it to a whole new approach, and our young people, and our young people in particular, in many times I think have trained us as adults for even stronger sound environmental principles in our homes, around our yards, and in particular with waste. So there's many areas that we could touch upon, but I think whenever this government leaves office, and that'll be up to Nova Scotians to decide, I think one of the areas, and I noted in one of my first articles after the election of 2009, I noted a couple of areas that the NDP government, after their time in office, would in fact would have that close examination and that real test as to what went on. And one of the areas, and I was natural resources critic at the time, and one of the developments that had started in the province, of course, was the development of a forest strategy. And we know that all over Nova Scotia, in every county, our forests are a treasured resource. And that's from, in terms of all of the recreation uses, the unique habitats, the wildlife, also for generations. Nova Scotians have used the forests to make a very, very good living. But our forests were under immense attack. And we know that voluntary planning was one of the vehicles, one of the means in which we in Nova Scotia could get a very wide lens view of what was happening in our forests. And voluntary planning and their work across the province, it brought to the table, the scientific community, people who had worked in our forests, It brought the technicians, it brought all kinds of associations dealing with the environment, Wildlife Federation, a whole range of people came together to speak about how they wanted to see the next 75 to 100 years shape for the forests of our province. And we know that as a result, the plan came out, a natural balance, and we know that it set out some very, very strong recommendations as to how the forests of the future could indeed be shaped. Because we knew that our forests was under immense stress and, in fact, possibly, many would say, reaching a tipping point. Before we lost one of our mills, we had moved to getting close to 10% of our wood fiber having to be imported to keep our 3 mills going because our forest was under that kind of stress to provide for the paper industry. So the natural balance was going to allow us to chart a new course. And we all know that over the last couple of years, we really haven't got down to the business of accepting the strongest recommendations. And I just wanted to take a few minutes really to point to one that I thought would in fact be well underway by now, and that is we would see a real difference in the amount of clear cutting going on in our forests. Now, I know there are some wonderful examples of sustainable forest practice. We have some private woodlot owners, and I've gone to a few of these to walk through some of their acres, or I've been taken through on a buggy to look at what their operations are actually like. And it's amazing when you go into a forest that has strong silviculture practices and also sustainable harvesting methods. There's a real difference than when you head into an area that in fact has been clear cut, and what it looks like afterwards, and what it can look like for several years if you don't get some good management of the forest, and you get the proper mechanical weeding in that forest. We all know what it can grow back to look like. You know, I think in the past week or so, this whole issue, some may say, oh, it's just through the eyes of one Nova Scotian as he views the forest. But I think, what Jamie Simpson put before us as MLAs is something that we all need to take to heart. I know, yes, the member for Queens, talks about the Tobeatic Wilderness, some of the Mersey lands and the riparian zones that need to be protected. But I've had the opportunity to fly over southwestern Nova Scotia, and I can assure you, our forests in that area are not in very good shape. Once you take out, Kejimakuji, the national park, and some other protected areas, there is tremendous devastation in that area of Nova Scotia. I'm going to read into the record today. Government is not going to like this, but I'm going to read Jamie's letter to MLAs, because I think it is extremely relevant, and it is something that we need to actually give some thought to. And he says, "Dear MLAs, 3 years ago, I helped organize a rally of support for the NDP's promise to stop whole tree harvesting and reduce clear-cutting. People across Nova Scotia, representing a wide diversity of forestry interests, gave the NDP solid support to stop the destruction of our forest resources. The NDP put these promises in writing and passed them through Cabinet. Sadly, the NDP has so far failed to follow through with these promises. These are strong words, but they are deserved. I'm a professional forester and woodlot owner. I've written a book on sustainable forestry, and I've worked as a logger. I've read every study and report on forestry harvesting methods in Eastern North America. I've discussed forestry with woodlot owners, forest product manufacturers, and contractors across Nova Scotia. Please believe me that the NDP is complacent in the destruction of our forest and forest industry, and the people of the province know it. Simply put, every whole tree clear-cut the NDP allows eats away at the economic value and productivity of our forest resource. You are allowing the mining of our forest resource. Is this the legacy the NDP wishes to leave? A professional logging contractor recently wrote to me in response to the billboards. I moved to Nova Scotia from New Hampshire, where I was a logging contractor. Almost all of my jobs were commercial thinnings, and we left a good mix of uneven age crop trees. I was proud of my work, leaving the forest healthy and able to recut again in as little as 10 years or so. When I moved here, I was astounded by the horrible practices I saw. I could not believe this type of clear-cutting was allowed, totally devastating the forest, leaving a barren landscape and ruining wildlife habitat with no good future for a healthy forest for a lifetime. It makes me sad. The NDP is failing to provide leadership on progressive forestry. The Natural Resources Strategy Review, which gave the NDP solid public support for progressive change and comprehensive recommendations from the expert panel, appears abandoned. Worse still, the NDP recently redefined clear-cutting. As a professional forester, the definition makes no sense to me. It seems its only purpose is to allow clear-cutting to continue under a different name, and that is an embarrassment to our province. I am dedicated to seeing Nova Scotia transition towards smart, sensible forestry policies that puts forest workers, communities, small business, and the long-term viability of our forestry industry first. I am always happy to discuss these issues. There are many solutions to this problem. All that seems lacking is political will to respect the wishes of Nova Scotians. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Respectfully, Jamie Simpson, registered professional forester, and I will table that for the House. And you know, I've had the opportunity to go, in fact, into an area, the member from Guysborough Sheet Harbour, and I went down to meet a couple of forestry operations there when I was natural resources critic, and I remember one of the walks in particular, and the forester pointed out that, you know, this is Crown land. When you come back, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, there's a good chance that a lot of this won't be standing. We're going to have to feed the 60-megawatt biomass mill, and it isn't going to be byproduct from the mill that's going to go in there. We're going to need a lot of hardwood. And he said, take this tree here, for example. And he measured the circumference, looked at how straight the tree was, and he said, this tree sold to the right hardwood plant is worth around $250. One tree. And it just points out that, you know, we have to look at our forest resource, I think, in a very different way than what, you know, we have been for really now several generations. And when that document came out, you know, A Natural Balance, and I read the work of Donna Crossland and Bob Bancroft, And I said, you know, if we get about 50% even of the recommendations and the direction of creating a healthy, viable forest, if we can get partway there, you know, we will ensure future generations of Nova Scotians that they will, you know, truly be able to say, you know, we have made a difference. And I think that was the golden opportunity that so far, and not just my view, but Nova Scotians are saying, we now have a missed opportunity to make a difference in much of our forests across Nova Scotia. And I would remind a member from Queens, you know, that she talked about how her granddaughter, you know, will look at preserving some forest area. But I think she'll also point out that my grandmother was part of a government that allowed whole tree harvesting, the worst form of forest destruction that we can possibly ever have allowed to take place. And this was something that I was pretty certain would come to an end. I thought this would come to an end over the past 3 years. But we know it is still being practiced in our province, and it does, in fact, go against, you know, the best ecological principles. It goes, you know, away from strong forestry and an environmental balance in our forests. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, we do need to make changes. There is no question about it. We have the blueprint. We have before us something that, in fact, is not available in some areas of the country, that we could be, in fact, making sure that our forests for the next 100 years are well safeguarded, and that all of us who have had a chance to fashion legislation would have had a hand in making a strong forestry future in our province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take an opportunity to just make a few comments, mostly in regard to the comments made by the member opposite. I'm quite close to the environmental concerns that he raised around forestry. And I think the member may want to go back further in history to look at what the history of his party is in terms of forestry practices in this province. But that will be a very short conversation. So, Mr. Speaker, I want the honourable member and all members to be aware, because I actually was the minister that was involved with the contract around the biomass plant at Gestora, and so the issue the member raised around the $250 tree, that whole process is around highest and best use. So that trees that have that kind of value, at least the part of the tree that has that kind of value, because it'd probably be the butt log that has the most value, but certainly because the mill's responsibility to the Crown is to pay stumpage. And so therefore, they're gonna try to sell those trees in the best market that they can. So therefore, highest value, and actually what was written into the contract is that they have to ensure highest value so that the high quality trees are not chipped up and burned, but more residual, lower quality parts of the tree, because you're certainly going to get into the tops and whatever that you may not get any significant good straight timber, and so lower value certainly is the issue. And the one And the one issue around low-value trees is it provides a market that allowed them to get into stands that were mixed with fairly high quality but low quality, which were not feasible to take men and machinery into to harvest. And this offered an opportunity to take the higher value components out of those stands and still sell that lower quality material or make a use of it, which would be in the biomass plants. And I think the member might want to think a bit. The letter he referred to talks about whole tree clear cutting, which is not actually the rule of thumb across this province. I mean, there are clear cuts for sure, and our whole tree harvesting is not the rule of the day across this province. But the issue around clear cutting to move to 50% in 5 years, and we all can debate whether that's low enough. And I think that. But if you're comparing it to 97% of the harvest is clear cut in the province, moving to 50%, and that means that if we assume a 10% reduction year to year, that in your first year you're going to have about 90% clear cutting. The next year you're going to have 80%. The next year you're going to have 70%, until you get down to 50%. And that allows the government the opportunity to actually evaluate just how this is going, whether our determination of site-specific harvesting actually will work. In other words, there are some stands that clear cutting is a reasonable option when it comes to harvesting those stands, but we don't believe it's a reasonable option on all stands in the forest, Mr. Speaker. So it is one that I think this government actually has shown foresight and vision and action. Not only did they talk, but they walked the talk. And so this is one that, and I think that, certainly with the opposition, on the other side of the House, and Nova Scotians generally, I think would be interested to see in 5 years or 10 years, did this really work? And the government is I think, interested to know what we put in place. Has it achieved the goal that we hoped it would? And then it's a question of we should tweak this or do something different in order to get us there. And I think Nova Scotians will help us do that. But I think they truly will recognize that when it came to change in forestry practices, this government did it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
If I am to recognize the Minister of Environment, it'll be to close debate on Bill 136, the Green Economy Act. The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Speaker. And first of all, to the members opposite, I want to acknowledge, first of all, in the discussions tonight, that acknowledge that the recognition that all parties supported EGSPA initially. And also, there were some great quotes, Mr. Speaker, that came from the opposition. I just want to highlight them for the record. And first of all, Nova Scotia is the first jurisdiction in the country to have this kind of legislation. This was acknowledged, and I want to recognize that. A couple of quotes from the opposition, and I think my staff will probably be recording them as I speak. But what I made note of is that EGSPA is a copy that's used around the world. And the second one, EGSPA has been a model used in other places. So them is great quotes, and I'm sure my staff will be documenting them. But Mr. Speaker, just to conclude, I want to thank my colleagues here for their kind comments and remarks. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to close debate on Bill 136, the Green Economy Act, and move second reading. Thank you very much for your attention.
The question is for a second reading of Bill 136, a Green Environmental Act. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. All those opposed? Motion is carried.
Bill number 136, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 7 of the Acts of 2007, the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act.
Order that Bill number 136 be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call private local bills for second reading?
Private and local bills for second reading.
Please call Bill 139, Acts Respecting the Sisters of St. Martha.
Bill number 139, Acts Respecting the Sisters of St. Martha's. The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 139, an act to amend Chapter 141 of the Acts of 1918, an act to amend and consolidate the acts respecting the Sisters of St. Martha's, be read a second time, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the most part, this is a housekeeping bill. But there are one or two substantive portions of it as well. And with your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, before sort of looking at the bill proper, I would like to, I'm sure many of my friends in the House know the Sisters of St. Martha's and have had positive experiences with them. I certainly have my personal experiences with the Sisters of St. Martha's are family related. Three of my mother's sisters, three of my aunts, were members of the Sisters of St. Martha's, and I personally have been involved with the Sisters of St. Martha's since I can remember. One of my earliest memories of the Sisters of St. Martha's was in Antigonish when my family traveled to Antigonish, to Bethany, the mother house of the Sisters of St. Martha's, to visit one of my aunts who was stationed there at the time. And I remember being dressed in a blue serge suit. It was probably the first suit I ever had. I was probably 7 or 8 years of age. And I went out to at that time, the sisters were totally self-sustaining in terms of they ran a farm from which they grew all their own food and meats and vegetables and that kind of thing. They were excuse me, when I said self-sustaining, they made their own clothes. They even made their own shoes. But in any event, this Sunday afternoon, I remember being there and went out to the barn where the hens were kept and decided I would help the sisters by collecting some of the eggs for them. So I did take the eggs and I put them in my coat pocket and my pants pocket and walked from the hen house back to the mother house, and you can imagine what happened with the eggs. So my history with the sisters is a long-standing one, and it's been a very positive one for me. They've been tremendous support over my lifetime, really, in terms of the connections I've been able to have with them. But I want to tell the people of the House, the members of the House, and a little bit about the sisters themselves. The Sisters of St. Martha's, they date their sort of official time from 1900. From the year 1900, but in fact, for a few years just prior to that, they were in existence. They came into being officially, I guess, in 1900, but were not incorporated until 1907. And in 1907, that was when they had their certificate of incorporation. Following that, there were a number of changes made in their documentation, but the last major sort of change was in 1918, and that is the bill that we're looking at today, Bill 139, is basically amendments to that 1918 Act. As I said at the beginning, Mr. Speaker, the bill is basically a housekeeping bill. Because this was a 1918 bill act that we're amending, some of the language in that act is quite historic and quite, I guess, archaic would be the best word to use for it. And I'll give you an example of that. If you look at Section 2 of the bill, they talk about some of the kinds of things that the sisters did in their time. And they had an exemption, tax exemption, property tax exemption for the properties that they held to do the work they did. And this is the kind of properties that were exempt. A training school for nurses, hospitals, orphanages, infants' homes, infirmaries, sanitaria, reformatories, refuge, and other charitable and I'm going to have trouble with this one, eleemosynary institutions. So those are the kinds of, that's the kind of language that was in the 1918 bill, and that's one of the reasons we're coming forward with this bill today, is to, eleemosynary is charitable works, charitable institutions. That is one of the reasons we're coming forward today. This bill is, as I said, there are some substantive parts of it as well. One of them is that it contains in it a clause that allows them to wind up the organization. And of course, the original Act would not have had that in it, but this new Act does allow that to happen. This bill allows that to happen. Not that that's anything on the horizon, but it's kind of, again, as a housekeeping measure. The Sisters of St. Martha are still quite a lively organization, although there's no one in the novitiate today. They do have some fairly young members, and they are a going concern. And that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize. This bill also deals with the sisters amending their objects to comply more readily with the CRA requirements to establish or to maintain charitable status. And the sisters actually have, if you look at the objects of the corporation, as is noted in this bill, one of the objects, of course, is the relief of poverty. A second object is the advancement of education. A third object is the advancement of religion, of course, and the fourth object is other purposes beneficial to the community. Those are the four pillars, I guess, that you would call that the CRA looks at in determining whether an organization is entitled to have charitable status. And the Sisters of St. Martha's have had that charitable status since their beginning and are maintaining it now and are still active on all four of these heads. People will know that the Sisters of St. Martha's have been incredibly a strong force in health promotion in the province. The original St. Martha's Hospital was built by the Sisters of St. Martha's, and it was built on their property. And in order to fund that hospital, they mortgaged their mother house and the properties that they had to raise the money to build the hospital. They built hospitals in Cape Breton as well, and actually out west in Canada. They later on, a second time, they mortgaged their mother house in order to get the funds to build the R.K. Macdonald nursing home in Antigonish. That's the kind of work that the sisters have done and are doing and continue to do. So I could talk about the Sisters of St. Martha in detail for a lengthy period of time, but I want the people, the host, to realize that us agreeing to this, to having this bill go forward, for them enables them to bring their incorporation documents up to date, to modernize them. They basically, the old documents talked about the leadership being Mother Superior or Sister Superior, that kind of thing. The documentation this changes the documentation to talk about the president of the company and the vice president of the company and that sort of thing. And it's really business language. I'm not sure they're probably very comfortable with it, but the advice they have is that they should go forward with these changes. I should say as well that the changes that were proposed have been vetted by CRA and approved by CRA in terms of them being able to carry on with their charitable status. So again, as I said, Mr. Speaker, I could go on. There are a couple of points I wanted to make, I guess. Basically, this bill does not give the sisters any additional powers. It doesn't make any substantial changes, give them any more in terms of property protection or anything of that nature. Again, it's basically an update of old language at this time. I guess modernizing it is basically what I'm trying to say. And and particularly with reference to the dissolution clause that didn't exist previously. They are the major changes here. So, Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I would move the second reading of this bill, again, an act to amend Chapter 141 of the Acts of 1918, an act to amend and consolidate the acts respecting the Sisters of St. Martha. Thank you.
The question is for second reading of Bill 139, Acts respecting the Sisters of St. Martha's. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, motion is carried.
Bill number 139, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 141 of the Acts of 1918, an act to amend and consolidate the acts respecting the Sisters of St. Martha.
Order that Bill number 139, Acts respecting the Sisters of St. Martha's, order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Private and Local Bills. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call public bills for third reading?
Public bills for third reading.
Speaker, could you please call Bill 97, the Fairer Power Rates Act?
Bill number 97, the Fairer Power Rates Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today on third reading of the Fairer Power Rates Act, Bill number 97. And Mr. Speaker, today I want to reaffirm this government's commitment to making electricity rates fairer and easier for families to manage as part of their household budgets. And I know that people have been frustrated and concerned about power rates. In fact, in my own hometown of Pictou, I've been on the doorsteps and I've heard directly from people that it is a concern to them. And I just want them to know, and others, Nova Scotians to know, the government is ensuring the lowest electricity rates possible, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We brought this legislation forward that will permanently remove executive bonuses from being paid, even in part, by ratepayers. And we're also recommending that executive salaries are capped at a level that's comparable with the senior civil service, with that of a deputy minister level in the public service. And anything above that level of compensation would have to be paid by shareholders themselves. We're also recommending no further rate increase applications until 2015. And on top of this, Mr. Speaker, we want all rate applications filed on a multi-year basis in order to reduce costs to charge to ratepayers for that hearing process. Did you know, Mr. Speaker, that a hearing can cost as much as $2 million? If we cut down on those rate hearings, then that's going to save money for ratepayers in this province. I know the Conservatives want to freeze electricity rates and move to renewable power over a much longer period of time, but I think that's really chaining us to the past. The Liberals, on the other hand, want to they've introduced their Ratepayer Protection Act that would see deregulation, as well as end the stakeholders' ability to come to a mutual settlement agreement. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important to remember that the Conservative Party was the ones that privatized Nova Scotia Power, and then it was the Liberal government that followed up on that and began the practice of, through EMARA, the establishment of EMARA, practice of having ratepayers pay those high salaries and executive bonuses in the first place. So we just don't think it's fair that ordinary Nova Scotians, ordinary ratepayers have to pay those executive bonuses and high salaries and by ratepayers for amongst the families of this province, that many are which are struggling to make ends meet. So this act, Mr. Speaker, will end that. Will end it permanently. Mr. Speaker, this government has a plan to address the rising costs of electricity. Our plan is focused on making sure that Nova Scotia does not repeat the same mistakes that past governments made. It is focused on protecting the interests of future generations while also protecting our environment. It is focused on helping Nova Scotians in the short term as we move to a more stable, diverse, and a cleaner electricity system. So, Mr. Speaker, we're standing up for Nova Scotians. We're standing up to ensure that they get the lowest, fairest rates over both the short term and over the long term. And to do this, we must change the way that we power our province. The status quo is no longer acceptable. The cost of imported coal has gone up about 75% in the past 7 years. And for too long, previous governments ignored this issue and clung to an electrical system of the past. Mr. Speaker, we need to take action. We need to take action now to address this. And that's why we're developing local, more renewable sources of energy to get us off of expensive imported coal. We're blessed here in Nova Scotia with many good sources of home energy from wind and tidal and sustainable biomass, hydroelectricity, and so on. It's why our government is today saving Nova Scotians 10% on each power bill by cutting the provincial portion of the HST from electricity, something the Leader of the Opposition called bad public policy, and in a debate that he participated in 2009. And I don't agree with that at all, because I think it is a good public policy. So, Mr. Speaker, we're removing the HST from home heating. That saved already the average Nova Scotian more than $700 on their home energy, on their electricity bill. Not only would the Liberals put that HST back on home heating, but they would also ensure rates go up because they're promoting deregulation. Deregulation will cost 30 to 50% more than what's presently. It's not worked in Alberta, it's not worked in Ontario, it's not worked in California, it's not worked in Maryland, it's not worked anywhere it's been tried. Our proposed legislation will also cap salaries that are charged to ratepayers. We'll limit the number of costly rate hearings and ensure that a board-ordered savings reviews of Nova Scotia Power. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, welcome to the chair. I'll ask you, what have the Liberals done? Well, the Liberals introduced legislation that would force Nova Scotia Power to set performance standards around reliability and impose significant fines on Nova Scotia Power when they aren't met. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, there's already in place a system that will protect Nova Scotians. The UARB already mandates Nova Scotia Power to maintain a reliable and high-performance electricity system. I'm surprised the opposition wasn't aware of that. Mr. Speaker, a reliable electricity system is important in our daily lives. It's important for our economy. Regulators have set standards for reliability for utilities right across North America. Nova Scotia Power is obligated to meet all of these mandatory North American industry operational and planning standards. It is already subject to independent third-party audits by the regulatory authorities, including our own utility and review board. It must meet rigorous standards set out by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and also the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. Nova Scotia Power is also required to remain in good standing with the Maritime Reliability Coordinator, which, as we know, is the New Brunswick system operator. Third-party audits are carried out by each of these organizations to ensure compliance, and Nova Scotia Power has been found to be consistently compliant. Furthermore, the UARB can also conduct independent audits and benchmarking on Nova Scotia Power's electricity service reliability. And, Mr. Speaker, the UARB can initiate, and have done so in the past, third-party audits and Nova Scotia Power's electricity service reliability benchmarking of both their system and of their performance. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is touting deregulation as a way to reduce electricity prices, and I don't believe that Nova Scotians can afford that. As I mentioned, it's failed in Alberta, it's failed in Ontario, it's failed anywhere it's been tried, and all it's done is cause huge rate spikes in those provinces or states. Nova Scotia Power is obligated by law to serve all Nova Scotian loads at the lowest possible cost while meeting the system reliability and its environmental obligations. The Utilities and Review Board, an independent body, ensures that that happens. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the opposition of how we got here today. Nova Scotia has a history of using imported coal as the main source of fuel to generate electricity. Coal is dirty, it's expensive, it's imported, and it's a polluting source of fossil fuel. Mr. Speaker, we understand that the path to the future is through renewable, local, and regional sources of clean energy. Sources like wind power, tidal power, sustainable biomass, local hydroelectricity, even cleaner natural gas is an alternative. In 2010, our government released its renewable electricity plan to promote and develop both large-scale and small-scale renewable electricity projects. But we didn't stop there. We also put into place renewable targets that would see 25% renewables by 2015 and 40% by 2020. We've also placed hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions in our electricity to help meet both our environmental and our energy objectives. And I should mention that we were recognized as a province for being a world leader at the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, recognized by the United Nations Committee on Climate Change. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that our plan is working. We're also bringing in measures to help Nova Scotians save energy in their own homes while adding green jobs to our economy. Mr. Speaker, programs through Efficiency Nova Scotia have saved Nova Scotians across this province more than $200 million in energy savings. I know the Liberals want to eliminate that program, but it's working for Nova Scotians. As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, our electricity plan takes us out to the year 2020, and we are confident we are on track to meet both the renewable targets and the greenhouse gas targets that we have in place. And I think that's a good thing that we did, because the new federal coal regulations, they've set an emission target for out to 2030 that would have us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by a further 3 megatons over the 2020 target. That means that we as a province must tap into more sustainable sources of energy in order to meet that target. If not, the federal government is going to do it for us, and they'll do it their way. And that would carry a substantial price tag, somewhere in the range of estimated of $1.3 billion. So getting off of coal is no longer simply a choice, it is now a federal requirement. And that is where hydroelectricity from the Lower Churchill comes in. The Lower Churchill will ensure that the lowest, fairest rates over the long term. It will provide Nova Scotia with access to renewable power at fixed rates for 35 years. And will really put us in an energy loop instead of being at the end of the line. This means that we will have more choices. We'll be able to take power from multiple directions at market rates. And Mr. Speaker, the hydroelectricity from the Lower Churchill will also be a reliable energy source to back up our increasing use of intermittent energy, like wind and tidal. And of course, Mr. Speaker, this project will create good jobs for Nova Scotians right here at home. So, Mr. Speaker, we know the impact of the cost of imported coal and electricity bills right across this province, and we're doing something about it. Mr. Speaker, we are standing up for Nova Scotians to ensure that we have the lowest, fairest electricity rates possible while we pursue the lowest cost option for stabilizing rates over the longer term. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for the time and for the members' attention, and I look forward to what other members may have to say. Thank you very much.
Your Honor, would the minister like to move second reading? Third reading, I'm sorry.
97, the Fair Power Rates Act.
Thank you very much. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise again to speak on Bill 95, the Fair Power Rates Act, Mr. Speaker. 97. Well, I want to thank the Honourable Minister for that. It's like so much of this bill, it's really doesn't mean a whole lot to ordinary Nova Scotians, so the number, whether it's 95 or 97, probably won't make a lot of difference either, but I understand for clarification in the House and for recording of answered. Mr. Speaker, I hear some people talk over there. I'm looking forward to the opportunity when they get up and chat about this particular piece of legislation that actually does nothing to the power bills in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it has not, will have a zero impact on the people of Nova Scotia, except for the fact power rates are going to increase 3% as of January 1, because this minister has been unable to act and defend the ratepayers of this province while yet he stands up and defends the status quo in this House time after time after time of Nova Scotia Power. Mr. Speaker, the executive compensation package that the minister seems to be talking about in this act has been dealt with for quite some time. As a matter of fact, the last two rate hearings before the Utility Review Board, the executive compensation package was not part of the rate hearing, Mr. Speaker. It had been set aside and was being covered outside of the rate hearing and being covered by the company. While we believe, and we do support the concept of that should be taken completely out of the rate and be legislated, that the executive compensation should be capped and that the bonuses should never be part of any future rate hearing, is a positive thing, Mr. Speaker, one that I know the member from Dartmouth East has talked about time and time again. As a matter of fact, he's introduced legislation in this House that would have legislated that, Mr. Speaker, a year and a half ago if the government had seen fit to recognize it then. And really, if they had asked him, many of these pieces of this bill would have been part of some of the solutions facing Nova Scotians. It was interesting for me to listen to the minister stand and talk about the fact that audits are available now as a tool for the Utility and Review Board to use. Mr. Speaker, a year and a half ago, I'd say, maybe the minister and the Premier stood in this House and told all members of this House that the Utility Review Board could order a performance value audit if they wanted to. But what do we have now, Mr. Speaker? A piece of legislation that would actually put it in place, because they now have realized that it wasn't an option for the Utility Review Board. But, Mr. Speaker, instead of legislating the fact that that should happen every year or 2 years, and the fact that the cost of that audit should be borne by the utility, what the minister has done is actually laid in place and just made the option available to the Utility Review Board. So technically, Mr. Speaker, what he has done here is just put another tool in the hands of the Utility Review Board without any measurables around it, without forcing this company to go under a performance value audit. It's been the view of this caucus that there should never be another rate hearing increase in the province of Nova Scotia until we do a performance value audit of this utility, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that all of the tough decisions that every other small business and every other business operator in this province have had to make inside of their own operation, that this utility does the same thing. And we know they have a history, Mr. Speaker, of not doing that. They have a history, Mr. Speaker, of quite a substantial amount of largesse inside of this utility and expecting ratepayers time after time after time to pick up the tab. Mr. Speaker, it was only about a year and a half ago when I had the privilege to be in front of the Utility Review Board, to asking the President of Nova Scotia Power questions about the executive compensation, and he made it very clear that it's not in the interest of Nova Scotia Power or the executives to look after shareholders. It's in their interest to look after themselves, Mr. Speaker. And when he laid out the fact that they reduced the number of executives from 12 to 8, but the compensation package remained the same, clearly tells you they are not on the side of consumers in this province. They are on the side of themselves and their largesse and the shareholders of that utility. And, Mr. Speaker, when the government sits and idly by and allows that to happen, it tells you what side of the equation they're on as well. It's not on the side of Nova Scotia ratepayers. It's on the side of shareholders, Mr. Speaker, and not ratepayers. If this government stood for ratepayers, this act would be completely different. This act would be completely different, Mr. Speaker. There would be no rate increase until performance value audit was done of this utility. It's pretty straightforward. Minister has the ability to do that today. The minister's had the ability to do that. Forcing the Utility Review Board to do performance value audit of Nova Scotia Power would be a small token of gesture on his part before he allowed them to increase any power bills in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, during his remarks, the minister spoke about reliability and how this utility has met every benchmark that's been put in front of it. I'm not sure that Nova Scotians would agree, Mr. Speaker, with that they would consider the reliability of this utility to be top-notch. Mr. Speaker, if this minister was serious about making sure that the reliability of this of the asset wasn't top-notch, Mr. Speaker, they would put measurables in place to making sure that this government reached standards that were being set. It's interesting, if the minister goes down to any rate hearing and any rate increase, if he looks at when this utility starts negotiating which aspect of the rate increase that they're going to give away, take away if they reduce by a point here or a point there, the first thing they attack and the first thing they go towards is vegetation management. Mr. Speaker, if for anyone in the utility business, whether it's in this province or any other province, recognizes reliability, in order to have serious reliability in the province, vegetation management is at the forefront. Many of the outages that happen in this province are the very fact of poor vegetation management. The utility acknowledges that, and utilities across the country acknowledge that, Mr. Speaker. But where's the first place they go when it comes to shaving a few dollars off here and there? It's not the executive compensation package, it's not the bonuses being handed out. It's towards the issue of vegetation management, which directly speaks to reliability of their service. One of the other things that the minister spoke about is utilities' responsibility to find the lowest cost options to meet their responsibility to ensure that Nova Scotia customers are not being, I'll say, gouged, Mr. Speaker. And it was refreshing recently to hear the Utility Review Board say, you know what, that the biomass plant in the Strait area is not, Mr. Speaker, the cheapest source of energy that this province could acquire, nor is it necessary to put it online to meet the goals in the Sustainability Act. It's before this House, Mr. Speaker. And they said to the government, you're going to have to legislate it. It was refreshing to hear them say that. I'm looking forward to that discussion whenever that happens during this session, because the Deputy Minister of Energy and the Minister of Energy have made it clear that they're going to put that source of energy production online. Mr. Speaker, that's not the cheapest source of energy that could be acquired by this province. Just to ask the Utility Review Board. So the minister's issue of saying that they're going to move towards legislating with the biomass plant in the Strait area, Mr. Speaker, means he's prepared to drive power rates up. Mr. Speaker, there's no other way around it. The Utility Review Board has said straightforward they can find cheaper energy, and this government is going to have to regulate it. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that has been talked about in this province has been renewable energies an awful lot. And there's also been the talk of this monopoly that we have that really is the only game in town, so to speak, Mr. Speaker. One of the things as we were moving towards renewable energy sector, there were things called IPPs that were being done, independent power purchase agreements, Mr. Speaker. And part of that document and part of that regulations around the IPPs, Mr. Speaker, was that Nova Scotia Power was not supposed to be part of any of those IPPs. It was an opportunity for renewable energy producers to be able to access to the energy market in the province of Nova Scotia. But in the infinite wisdom of the Premier, Mr. Speaker, they've allowed now Nova Scotia Power to have partial ownership of some of these IPPs. So the most recently there were two announced. 49%, each of them were 49% owned by Nova Scotia Power. Mr. Speaker, when you say it that way, you wonder what impact that's having on the rates in Nova Scotia Power, and what does it mean to Nova Scotia customers? Well, Mr. Speaker, what it means is that 49% of those two renewable energy projects are going to end directly on the equity sheet of Nova Scotia Power, which means that Nova Scotia customers are going to pay a 9% return on that. Mr. Speaker, the equity of this company has grown substantially, almost 20% in the last 4 years, which means an additional 9% is being borne by the rate base in the province of Nova Scotia unnecessarily. If this government had the courage to stand by, not be bullied, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, by the utility, not being persuaded by the utility, might be a better choice of words, to follow the company line, what we could potentially have, and this is a very diverse renewable energy sector in the province of Nova Scotia, being owned by the private sector. being able to sell that energy back to Nova Scotia. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the most recent renewable energy agreement, I think, signed kilowatt around 7 cents. Would it be somewhere accurate, around 7 cents? Pretty good deal, Mr. Speaker. The only problem with it is the utility owns 49% of it. So we're not only paying for the energy, we're going to pay a 9% return on 49% of that. So we're getting hit in both directions. Yeah. So if this government only had the courage to stand by the IPP, the original intent, which was diversify the energy production in this province and allow renewable energy producers to sell directly into the marketplace, Mr. Speaker, to sell to our utility, force them to buy it at a reasonable rate. Nova Scotians could be purchasing reasonable renewable energy power today and not paying 9% rate of return on that agreement. Mr. Speaker, that's where we're at. And you know what? Until a government finally says to Nova Scotia Power, you are not going to set the energy rules for the people of the province of Nova Scotia, we're going to continue to be held at ransom by this utility, no matter what happens, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister spoke about the efficiency tax that is on every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia. Some people refer to it as the NDP electricity tax, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister knows and the premier knows, Mr. Speaker, that prior to the last election, they believed that should be paid for by Nova Scotia Power and its shareholders. That's what they believed in May of 2009. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, they believed it in the early days of June 2009. It wasn't until late June of 2009 and early July, after Nova Scotians had voted, that they changed their mind and decided that that tax belonged on every power bill in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. So what you have is a tax being borne by every ratepayer in the province of Nova Scotia, regardless of your ability to pay, regardless of your ability to access the programs, you're still being forced to pay. So in other words, low-income Nova Scotians who can't pay the power bill, who arrive at the door of every constituency office of the province of Nova Scotia looking for help, are paying an efficiency tax so that the wealthiest in our province can access efficiency programs. How is that fair, Mr. Speaker? How is that fair, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, no, Mr. Speaker, I'll give it to the Mr. Speaker. I will give it to the member from Hants East when he talks about taking the HST off, Mr. Speaker. But I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is completely disingenuous for any member of that government who went and knocked on doors and said they're going to take the HST off, and then right after they voted, slamming an efficiency tax on top of the power bill, Mr. Speaker. That is completely disingenuous, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to stand on the doorstep to tell Nova Scotians half the truth, Mr. Speaker. Maybe next time they'll knock on and explain the full truth, Mr. Speaker. That we'll give it with one hand, Mr. Speaker. We're going to take a lot more with the other hand. And Mr. Speaker, it was 8%. They also didn't tell them they were going to increase the HST by 2% on every other consumable item in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. They didn't tell them that, Mr. Speaker. So we'll give them that, Mr. Speaker. But the rest of the story is, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, but the rest.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, but the rest of the story, Mr. Speaker, is that, Mr. Speaker, while they may have taken $36 million off of every power bill with the reduction of the HST, Mr. Speaker, they've added $46 million to the power bills across this province with the NDP electricity tax, Mr. Speaker. And that's not what they told Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, before they voted. It's something that they delivered to them in the month of July after they had voted, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we believe in the efficiency programs. The question is who should pay. And it's Nova Scotia Power who should pay, Mr. Speaker, not every ratepayer, Mr. Speaker. And I hear a member saying on the rate base, the problem is, Mr. Speaker, they don't have the courage to tackle the rate of return. That's the problem. They think it's okay for Nova Scotia Power to take $130 million out of the pockets of hard-working Nova Scotians and funnel it out of our province. Funnel it out of our province to build their energy portfolio somewhere else. Invest in Maine, St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, they invested in Ontario, invested in Northeastern Pipeline, Mr. Speaker. Why are they so afraid to say, you know what, Some of that $130 million belongs in the province of Nova Scotia and should pay for the efficiency programs, Mr. Speaker, that your customers could benefit from, Mr. Speaker. This is about ratepayers. Unfortunately for that group, Mr. Speaker, it's only about shareholders and the utility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill, Bill 97, does nothing to protect Nova Scotia ratepayers today, Mr. Speaker, and it will do nothing to the power bills that are going to arrive in the mail next month, the month after, Mr. Speaker. It will do nothing to help Nova Scotians be able to afford the NDP electricity plan, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and the minister talked about Lower Churchill. Talking about that is going to be the answer for all that ails the province of Nova Scotia. I'm looking forward to the day when the minister can stand in this House or the Premier and tell us actually how much that project is going to cost and what it'll mean to the power bills, Mr. Speaker. They can't. And in the absence of any real solution to deal with the power problems in the province of Nova Scotia, they're trying to grab on to what's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador and hope that when it arrives here, it comes in somewhere reasonable, Mr. Speaker. Before we attach ourselves to it, and we're interested to see what's going to happen, we think they should look at it. It's an important project. It's one that we should be looking at. But before we assign our full commitment to that project, you would think the government would want to understand the cost of it and what it would mean. But then again, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that has written large checks to corporations without any idea of the amounts and just let them fill them in at some other later date. But we should be cautious about this. We should be cautious about this. It's my hope, as the minister moves into the holiday season, as he starts his new year, that he starts looking at other alternatives, looking at the option of bringing in renewable energy, Mr. Speaker, in from Quebec. As you know, Point Lepreau was down in New Brunswick. I think it's around 600 megawatts. That energy was being purchased from the province of Quebec. Why aren't we asking, what about purchasing that? The province of Quebec just signed an agreement, I believe it was with Vermont, for 6 cents a kilowatt. Is that too cheap for us? We only want to buy high-cost energy? It was at Point Lepreau, it's coming into New Brunswick. Why not explore the possibility of bringing that energy in? Mr. Speaker, and let's move away from the idea that the only people in this province that can deal and solve our energy problems is Nova Scotia Power. The best thing we can do, Mr. Speaker, is break that monopoly and allow competition in the energy market, the very thing that the IPP was supposed to allow to happen. Allow renewable energy producers outside of the utility who weren't going to be held to task by the utility. They were going to build their projects, they were going to be able to arrange a power purchase agreement and sell that energy into the grid. What's wrong with that? Why are we opposed to that? Just having, Mr. Speaker, the most recent one was at 7 cents. If we can deliver Lower Churchill power to Nova Scotia for 7 cents, Mr. Speaker, I think the president of Emera Nova Scotia Power would have let us in on that little secret long before now. Mr. Speaker, if this is about trying to provide relief for Nova Scotians, if this really was about trying to provide relief for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, they would have prevented the rate increase that is going to go forward in January until a performance value audit was done of Nova Scotia Power, Mr. Speaker. They would allow renewable energy producers to sell directly to customers, to allow competition in a highly regulated market, Mr. Speaker, to allow Nova Scotians to have some choice. That can't be a bad thing, Mr. Speaker. Allow Nova Scotians to have a choice. That's what this government should be pushing towards. Not bringing in legislation that would allow Nova Scotia Power to have rate increase this year and a rate increase the year after. And Mr. Speaker, I've said this before and I'll say it again, look out for the third year, when all the deferred costs that they've been allowed to push off come back to roost, because there will be a bill to pay if we do not change the way the government deals with this utility. We need to start forcing this utility to take responsibility for its own decisions and pay some of the freight, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to delivering energy costs to the people of this province. They can't take all the gravy and expect the ratepayers to pick up all of the scraps, Mr. Speaker. It is time that the government of Nova Scotia brought in meaningful legislation that would have a true impact on the ability of Nova Scotians to pay their power bills now, not in 2015, or Mr. Speaker, shall we say, after the next election, to quote the Chief Executive Officer of Emera. That relationship that between government, when he talked about how wonderful it's going to be, that we will be able to, we were prepared to shave off half of our point, quarter of our point. Speaker, I don't know if someone wants to correct. So did I refer to somebody wrong? You want me to correct it?
Chief Financial Officer.
I'll correct it if you like. Chief Financial Officer from Emera. So they got that right, Mr. Speaker. So they know him quite well. They got that part right, Mr. Speaker. So they got that part right. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that Emera knows who's buttering their bread in this House, Mr. Speaker, and it's the government of the day, Mr. Speaker. They know, Mr. Speaker, this government is going to allow them to run roughshod over the ratepayers of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. They know that it's the NDP government that will be unwilling to stand up and defend them. Do you remember during the last election when the President of Nova Scotia Power said it would be good for the utility if the NDP get into power? Mr. Speaker, I know why. I know why, Mr. Speaker, because they've allowed the Nova Scotia Power to run roughshod over the ratepayers ever since, Mr. Speaker. It's time this government did its job, and that is to protect the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker, and not the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish off by telling you, and I'm looking forward to part of this debate, this bill will have zero impact on protecting Nova Scotia customers from the 3% increase that is coming this January and the 3% coming later on, Mr. Speaker. It will have zero impact to help protect this utility, the customers, against, Mr. Speaker, the increases coming from the FAM, Mr. Speaker. This government has done nothing to protect the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. They've done nothing to protect the ratepayers. But what they have done, Mr. Speaker, is they've allowed the Chief Financial Officer of Emera to go to Ontario and go to the money markets and say, don't worry, our government will make sure that our share doesn't drop. Our government in Nova Scotia, the NDP government, will make sure that we protect the interests of Emera over the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. That's what we've got, is the utility, Emera, the Chief Financial Officer going into Ontario saying, the NDP government will make sure that if you give us your money, you'll get a healthy return on it, because the ratepayers in Nova Scotia have no choice, because the government of Nova Scotia won't stand up to help them. They're only going to make sure that Emera has its money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that minister wanted to do something to help Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, if he wanted to do something to help the rate base in this province, it would be to put a halt to what's happening at the Utility Review Board and force a performance value audit of Nova Scotia Power and deny any rate increase until that audit is done, Mr. Speaker. With those few words, I'll take my place.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have a few minutes this afternoon to take part in this debate on Bill 97. Something the government would like you to believe, and the minister and the premier would like you to believe, is fair for Nova Scotians when it comes to power rates, you know. And I guess it doesn't matter if I talk for 5 minutes, Mr. Speaker, or 55 minutes. The unfortunate piece is nothing will change, because that's the way it is in here with a majority government. They're going to see the bill through. We've heard quite a bit in the last few minutes, but you know, Mr. Speaker, when I think about fair power rates, I think about those people out there. I'd like us to go out, you know, and we stand here in our place on behalf of all Nova Scotians. We brought amendments forward to this bill in an effort to make it better, stronger, things that we feel should be done from both the Liberal caucus and from the Tory caucus. We think that there were some things worthy of further debate. I know through law amendments, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, things were immediately shot down, although our honourable members made efforts to see some amendments made and perhaps brought back to make this a better bill. I've heard others talk about bringing bills forward. I know, Mr. Speaker, as do others, that I have brought bills forward in this House that We could have debated long ago, but government chose that that was not worthy of debate. Although here we are today talking finally about fair power rates, it's just that it's missing a wee bit of substance, Mr. Speaker. Quite a wee bit, as a matter of fact. You know, when we think this bill is so good, if the minister thinks this bill is so good, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring him down to Hants County, and I'd like to introduce him to, Mr. Speaker, seniors that are out there that when I ask them, I don't know, I say to them, I don't know how you live on that income. They say, you know what, Chuck, I don't. I exist. And part of our struggles is this, and I'm going to tell you, every one of them mentioned the same thing. And I know we all face that around rural Nova Scotia in different parts. Healthcare issues, et cetera, and so on for these folks, trying to pay their rent. And now on top of that, we've seen increase after increase after increase in their power bills. They're wondering, where will it end? Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the answer is nobody really knows at this point in time, because government is going to allow, again this fall, 3%, maybe, depending on what's resolved. Again, the following year, another one. They could have stopped that now. They have the power to stand here and introduce a bill like this. They have the power to step up and say enough is enough. Let's take a time out here. Let's review and let's say that this is good. We talked a lot about Muskrat Falls in the days leading up to where we are now in this House, Mr. Speaker. We know that this is not a done deal yet, but the government is adamant to push it through without even thinking about the alternatives. Have we asked how many times? I don't know how many times. Many times I know that I've asked and others have asked, what's the cost? You know, people are asking, what's this going to cost us? This is a big deal. They're reading about it in the media, they're doing this and they're doing that, but they're not getting all the real facts. I looked at a review this afternoon from Newfoundland, from the Public Utility Board, that's been going on for some time. It's far from a done deal there, and depending on which media source you listen to and watch in Newfoundland, you'll see that it's not altogether maybe the greatest thing on behalf of some Newfoundlanders. They're concerned about issues over there, and rightfully so. This is a big deal for Newfoundland as well as for Nova Scotia potentially. Again, you know, nothing wrong with looking at renewable energy sources, and we've said that many times. We'll continue to say that at a pace that's affordable. And when the minister stands up, Mr. Speaker, and he said this, their government wants to put something forward that is the best rates, fair power rates for Nova Scotia, but yet you can't determine what a fair power rate is. I think Nova Scotians have a hard time buying into that and accepting that, you know, that this is a real opportunity when they really don't know what the opportunity exists really of. And when it comes to prices, people want to know what their budgets are. Many people are living paycheck to paycheck, who are working every day, who both parents are working, or both people are working in the family, sometimes more.
Working poor, too.
The working poor, sometimes referred to, and a lot of people refer to themselves as being part of that group in this province. Times are hard. They realize that. They know what the economy's like, not only in Nova Scotia but around the world. They know how things are. They have hope, still have hope, Mr. Speaker, that there will be a better time as we move forward this year, next year, and the years afterward. But it's hard to instill that hope and believe in that hope when you continue to see things like your power bill going up with no real end in sight. The minister talks about 2015 here, perhaps, and putting a freeze on or making some kind of review then. It's going to be too late for businesses. We've already seen businesses, unfortunately, speak clearly to the fact that we're closing because one of the key problems is very high power rates. We just cannot afford to meet those financial strains. They can't do it. That is very unfortunate. And it's, you know, we're seeing companies go out of business that have been around a long time, or parts of companies that go out of business that have been around a very long time. And we worry about them people and their families who are working there. You know, and I've referred to this a couple of times. I'll refer to it today. Good meeting today in Hansport. The Minister of Economic and Rural Development was there, and I credit him for coming down. He said last week in this House, he committed that he would be there, and he was there. And we had a good discussion today when we were there. But I can tell you, you know, we talked about some of those employees going over to CKF. That's great. That's a wonderful thing. Maybe 40, maybe a little more. But you know what? It's going to take some time to get there. But there's still a large number of people that will see their employment in this particular place come to an end. And you can't tell me, Mr. Speaker, that them people aren't thinking about their families and how they're going to make ends meet and how they're going to pay their bills. Yeah, you know, there may be some kind of severances, maybe, or pensions. Some will be of retirement age, perhaps, few. Others may find work in other places, and I'm sure they're looking now and have been. But there will be others who are going to end up on EI, Mr. Speaker. And we all know that that only lasts for so long. And we know from other experiences in this province when people have lost jobs that sometimes EI comes and goes, and they still don't have a job. And then they end up on another system, the community service system, social service system. And again, it's very hard for these families, not only when they're working, but when you think about it, and they see an even lesser income going to EI and then the community services, those that may end up there. And we know, unfortunately, we know inherently some will, unfortunately, end up there. And we work hard to make sure that they don't. They don't want to be there, but then they get down. Life becomes very hard, even harder than it is now. And how do you get back out of that? You get back out of that by treating people fairly. And what was amazing about today's meeting was the company insisted and still carries the message, we're doing everything we can to make as much of this as easy as possible. Their families and their workers are considered family members. They care about them workers. They're doing the best they can for them. Government needs to take a little page out of that book and say, you know what, it really does matter, the people in Nova Scotia. You know that, Mr. Speaker? They really do matter. That's the reason that we stand in this place. And we try to put forward things that are worthy of debate and things that are good for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. But this bill doesn't do that. You know, we talk about, well, we should be talking about cutting rates and freezing them and going back if we want to review things then and have a look and say, what will the cost be? If you want to talk about it and you want to promise something, don't promise something when you don't know the answer to it, number one, and then take it away later. That just, people are not fooled by these things, Mr. Speaker. They want and know that power costs money. They know that it's expensive. It's expensive now. At 25% in the last 3 years or more that it's grown, it's going to grow another 4, 5, 6%. We know that. So here we are. They have come to accept that things are costing more money. They still have to, in all honesty and reality, Mr. Speaker, deal with and try to figure out how they are going to exist, because a lot of them will tell you, we're not living, especially that senior population who are pensioned off, Mr. Speaker, those single parents that are trying to work. Certainly, I know some different families who are struggling, who are on social service at the present time, and some who have worked hard to get off it, and some who continue to work hard to get off it. But life becomes more difficult every day, Mr. Speaker, when we keep hearing about increases, and more increases in everything, unfortunately. The bill does nothing to take these people aside and say, this is good for Nova Scotians, this is good for you. And people are asking, you know, when they hear the minister stand up and say, we want to provide, or we are providing, the fairest power rate for the people in the province of Nova Scotia, and they say, what's the cost? How can you tell me that you're doing that when we don't know what the long term really does mean? And we don't know. And you know, what happens if Newfoundland doesn't come to pass, Mr. Speaker? Have we thought about what those other markets will be? I know we've offered things in this House. We've talking about the, you know, a regional energy market whereby we can buy from other companies. I heard LaPro mentioned a few minutes ago coming back online. Bayside, I believe it's called, in New Brunswick, was generating energy for pennies, very few pennies, 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Why were we not out there? Because we're bound by 49%. We're bound by Nova Scotia Power's rules and Emera's rules, of which we see more money come into their pockets, Mr. Speaker, and we see more money leaving the province of Nova Scotia. They take it, they invest in other places, and we've heard this for some time. This is not new. They've been investing for years, $100+ million. I know we've done the math over the years, Mr. Speaker, and we see what happens. The big company keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The problem is they're buying and selling with one hand and then the other. You would almost look at this as perhaps declaring a conflict of interest in some ways, Mr. Speaker, you know. I think that we really need to focus more on the everyday people of this province who are working hard trying to make this province a better place to live. Mr. Speaker, if we really want to do good things, we need to look at how energy is affecting our families. We know that it is. And I've given a few examples here now. Even, you know, like I said, everyday hard-working people, working poor, my colleague called them, and they'll admit to that. They'll call themselves that because that's what they're doing. They're working just to barely survive. They don't have extras, Mr. Speaker. They'd like to have a few extras. They'd probably like to have a little holiday down then, but they can't, or they won't for fear of what might happen next. They know that times are tough. Some of them are very good at it, planning and managing. Others are not so good. We know that there are people who struggle at the best of times, Mr. Speaker, who have a hard time managing and trying to get through budgets and the stress and coping with everything as it is, and then we keep throwing more stress on them. It becomes very difficult. And we see that within families, Mr. Speaker. And over the years, in my past career, I've seen what stresses can do to people. And when you talk about people who are stressed and can't pay their bills, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that does some incredible things to people. It takes them a long ways from reality sometimes. They struggle, they worry, they wonder, how will I survive tomorrow? That's the reality in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We don't stand here and make these things up. We talk to these people as constituents in our offices regularly, more regularly now than we have in the past. And as times get tougher and more jobs are lost, we talk to them more and more and more and try to direct them to other places for other educational opportunities, perhaps other employment opportunities. And there was a time, not too many years ago, Mr. Speaker, whereby if somebody lost a job or was looking for a job and they were short a few hours or a week or two for EI to help get them through, there were 4 or 5 or 6 people that I could call up and say, hey, I've got a guy or a gal who needs some work. Can you put them through? And you know what? They were able, because things were a little more reasonable, affordable. They were able. You know what they say today? I don't have any of them people anymore. They're not there. Why? Because they're struggling themselves. Some of them don't exist anymore in business, unfortunately. Some of them have gotten older and retired. We'll continue to see that happen. And as everything begins to cost more, those people who are elderly and working are saying, why bother? For what reason? I might as well retire. I'm no farther ahead. There are no advantages, Mr. Speaker, only disadvantages. More taxes, higher power bills. Everything is higher, as we know, Mr. Speaker. But if the government wants to do something, wants to do the right thing, the government should take some of the amendments that were offered. That's what they should have done in this bill, from whomever. Taken pieces of every bill that's been introduced with regards to energy in this House, Mr. Speaker. Taken a little piece even of every bill and looked at it. And then went to Nova Scotians and said, what should we do with this? Is this good? Where are those groups? Should we be talking to people who are low-income families? You know, should we be talking to clients that are unfortunately on social services at the present time? Should we be talking to seniors and pensioners, Mr. Speaker, who are affected by these increases that will come in January and again in the following January? God knows where we'll be after that, Mr. Speaker, what will come next. And the big question we're all counting on in this House and promoting, not all, I shouldn't say, that side of the House is promoting, Mr. Speaker. They're worrying about Muskrat Falls and Newfoundland, when perhaps we should be worrying about community A, B, C, and D, and all the way through in Nova Scotia, and all the very fine residents that represent what we call home, Mr. Speaker. And with those few words, I will take my seat.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to take a few minutes to make some comments about this bill. You know, it's interesting that the minister in his remarks referred to the Liberals' Ratepayer Protection Act, and had he bothered to read it, you would actually know that it really didn't reflect anything that he talked about. That Ratepayer Protection Act had 3 provisions, and I just wanted to go through those 3 provisions. It was introduced on October 31st of last year. One provision prohibited bonuses for executives. And I can see that the minister hated that provision in that act so much that he included it in this act. Another provision in it required audits and spending reviews. And the only difference, and it's a significant difference, but the only difference between what was in the act that we proposed over a year ago and the minister's bill right now is ours were mandatory and the minister's are optional. And I think there's a fundamental difference there, because I think they should be mandatory. And I might add, as the Leader of the Opposition had stated earlier, both of those provisions, both the minister and the premier spoke against for over a year before introducing their own act with a version of those and insisting that they were already the case. So I am troubled by the fact that the minister would stand here before this House and suggest that the Ratepayer Protection Act, which he has now adopted parts of, is actually deregulation. Because if that is the case, then I guess the NDP have now just become the champions of deregulation. I mean, that's his own words just a few minutes ago, that he said that the Ratepayer Protection Act brought forth deregulation, and this is the minister that's just adopted 2 of the provisions from that act. The only other provision in the act, which I guess must be the one that he's concerned about, was to require that all settlement hearings be held in public. And I guess it must be, and we obviously tried in law amendments and we tried in committee of the whole to have that provision added to this bill. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting because it must be that the NDP are so opposed to public settlement meetings that they had to vote it down not once but twice, and that they refused to include that in. So here we have a government that is now moving forward with a bill that they say will change electricity and save people money, and yet they refuse to make the audits or the spending reviews, whichever word you wish to use, mandatory, excuse me, and they refuse to prohibit secret meetings. In fact, they voted against prohibiting secret meetings. I have trouble understanding that, Mr. Speaker. The minister then goes one step further, and to me, there are, I mean, obviously, and while I would obviously be reluctant normally to speak for the Tories as well, judging by the legislation they are introduced, I would suggest that they probably are also supportive of the provision, like we are, that removes executive bonuses in the bill. Both these parties, after all, had introduced legislation to do just that last year, and the Premier and the Minister spoke against it at the time, saying it was absolutely unnecessary, and now apparently it's necessary. However, there are issues. The Minister will not, that make this bill unsupportable, despite trying to adopt a couple of provisions from our bill in particular, the Ratepayer Protection Act. One of those is the fact that the Minister and his caucus have now twice voted down the prohibition on the secret meetings. The second part is the mandatory nature of those reviews, and I think the mandatory nature is very important because that review would have been required as it moved through the process. The other issue in this is the Minister has specifically excluded from the prohibition on rate increase hearings, or GRAs, fuel adjustment mechanism hearings, which many of the interveners down at the board over the past weeks have been speaking about the need to actually get rid of and move away from, yet the Minister doesn't seem to agree with the interveners. The Premier thought he was agreeing in question period earlier today with the consumer advocate. Unfortunately, he somewhat misrepresented what the consumer advocate said, and so I'm hoping I can find his comments here. And so that I can directly quote from what here we go. The Minister, or the Premier earlier today, suggested that the consumer advocate was quite happy with the settlement agreement. And while it is true that he signed on to it. He signed on to it with a proviso that even he indicated has never come from a consumer advocate before. And I'd like to read a couple of quotes from that, and then, of course, Mr. Speaker, I will table that. He noted that extending out the period to 2 years, which is in this Minister's Act, extending out the period to 2 years brings with it increased difficulty of predicting with accuracy relevant data in the second year. It says the two-year plan proposed by Nova Scotia Power, and now proposed by the NDP, would avoid the utility having to come before the URB in 2013 and is intended to proceed with a request for rate application applicable to 2014. The consumer advocate believes strongly that a significant influence in keeping rate applications to a minimum is the regulatory discipline that results from Nova Scotia Power knowing it must go through an application process to get a rate increase. That review process should be as uncomfortable as possible for Nova Scotia Power to ensure they minimize the requested increase. The discipline and then he goes on to talk about it, and then he follows up by saying the consumer advocate is concerned that at what point is it more beneficial to postpone the inevitable cost increases, and it might, and had there not been this procedure, and had there not been the famine, had there not been a settlement agreement, quote, it might result in a more vigorous search for a lower increase. So the Premier today said that the consumer advocate was all on side with this, and he's absolutely correct that he signed on to it, but he signed on to it saying that his problem is that he doesn't have the ability to look at the information. It says, it must be remembered that from Nova Scotia Power's perspective, they have nothing to lose by having a deferral in rate recovery. And yet that's exactly what the Minister is now proposing to legislate, is something where the Nova Scotia Power by the consumer advocate's own statement, has nothing to lose, and I'll table that statement. I'm sure the Premier and the Minister have read it before. This bill has no impact today. So, as the Leader of the Opposition said on January 1st, if the settlement agreement is approved, as you know, well, the analysts seem to think it will be, then what will happen? The rates will go up. And, you know, there won't be, interestingly enough, even Nova Scotia Power agreed to not doing a fuel adjustment mechanism for the 2 years as part of their rate increase, and the Minister couldn't even include that in his own bill. They will still go up. You will still see an adjustment to the efficiency Nova Scotia charge. You will still see a rate of return, if this settlement is approved, obviously we don't know if it will, that is above what the board's own consultant recommended it should be. It doesn't change any of that. There's no impact on rates, and there's no impact on rates conceivably until the 2014 application. Now, what's significant about that? The 2014 application is also when one would expect some of the Muskrat Falls charges to start coming through. But there's a lot of unanswered questions about that. And the Premier and the Minister want to stand up and say, well, you guys are against, whether it's Muskrat Falls or whatever else. I mean, Mr. Speaker, these guys call everything a game changer lately. I don't know how many times the game's going to change before they get it right. But the thing is that, let's take that one for now. You take Muskrat Falls, and it's not, the Minister and the Premier stand up and they say, well, you're opposed to that, you're opposed to that. Well, how can you be opposed or in favor if you can't get the information out of these guys? That's what Nova Scotians are asking for. They're saying, what's it going to cost? If the Premier and the Minister think they can stand up and say, this is a great deal for Nova Scotians, well, maybe it is. But to know that, they have to know what the cost is. And now, I mean, there's a number of questions that are being raised in Newfoundland and elsewhere and by some regulatory agencies, and it seems every week there's another one coming on with another question. You know, we've talked about the water rights issue. We've also talked about the fact that actually it turns out that as much as the Premier has talked about a number in that agreement, which I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, that Nova Scotia is entitled to, it is actually what that agreement says is that Nova Scotia is entitled to that number or 20% of the available power. It could actually be a lower amount. And the Premier and the Minister seem to have no backup plan should that either be delayed, not come to fruition, or not be available. There's also only a provision in that agreement for, I believe it's 25 years I might have the years not exactly right here, but 25 years and then 35 years. So what happens at the end of that? There's a reason why Nalcor owns the Maritime Link at the end of 25 years. There's a reason. They didn't just make that up. It's because if you look at the nickel mines in Labrador, the nickel mines in Labrador at that point start to need that power. There's a reason why Nova Scotia Power doesn't have the guarantee of 20% at the end of that agreement. It's because that 20% may be needed in Newfoundland, and they just had a story, and you know, the member for Hants East, thank you, the member for Hants East is laughing about that, but that's now been reported in a number of the news organizations and by their own regulatory agencies. So, you know, if he doesn't like what they're saying, well, I don't know what to suggest to him. They're raising that as a possibility, and Amir in their conference calls are saying, yep, that's why the agreement's there, because we don't know what the usage will be. And the member over here seems to be okay with that. And so when you ask, well, what's the plan beyond that 25 or 35-year period, the 25-year when you no longer own the Maritime Link, and that's in the agreement that we don't own it, then what is the plan after that point? It's a simple question. All Nova Scotians are looking for, all we're looking for, is answers to those questions. And when the answer comes back to say, well, oh, you're against it. No, it's a question, and I think it's a legitimate question to actually want to have an answer for. And if the government has an answer, then it's simple, just provide the answer. But by not providing an answer suggests that they don't have one to those questions either. I don't see how it could be taken any other way than assuming that they don't have an answer. If people ask these questions over and over and they're not answered, and now some of the other regulatory authorities are asking the same questions and not getting answers. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, I believe that there was an opportunity here to actually make this bill stronger, to make it actually have more of a meaningful impact. I am disappointed, obviously, that the NDP on 2 occasions in this bill process voted down the prohibition on secret settlement meetings. I'm disappointed that the spending reviews that they opposed so long they wouldn't make mandatory and they just put in there as optional. And I'm disappointed that the minister in his remarks stands up and once again seems to think that in fact, he points to the Ratepayer Protection Act by name and says that that shows Liberals support deregulation when he's yet to actually point out anything in that bill that is deregulation, since the 3 items in it are removing the bonuses from ratepayers or removing the bonuses from executives, the mandatory audits, not the unmandatory ones, and the 3rd item was the public meetings. I'm not sure which one of those he thinks is deregulation, but I think he's probably got a bit of research to do on that. I might add that since the minister might have some time after this bill is through, while we wait for this legislation on biomass, which I assume will come this session since the board ordered it, that he might want to go and read the latest report of the International Energy Association, which showed that in every market where competition has been increased in the past few years, rates have actually decreased. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the minister, the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this evening to speak on Bill number 97. Speaker, certainly this is a time of the year where unfortunately we hear, certainly as rural members, I can speak from my experience that the fall and coming into the cold weather is where we hear more and more from constituents who are having a hard time paying their power bills, because this is when they're getting the notices from Nova Scotia Power that they're going to be disconnected. And this is when families start to truly panic, because as the weather is turning colder, there's the fear of what that will do, not only for themselves, more importantly, in many cases, there are children involved. And even as of yesterday, I was working with one family that was in that exact situation. And it's a reminder again of how difficult it is for families to make ends meet, and too often their power bill is one of the areas where they tend to fall behind on when they're unable to continue to make their payments. So any chance that we have to discuss power rates and that we have an opportunity to raise the issue, I think is a good one. What's been a bit unfortunate with this bill is that it's interesting because in one sense the government says to the opposition, well, tell us what you would do differently. And as a government, you have 2 ways of reacting. You can say, okay, well, let's look at what their suggestions are and let's have an adult discussion about that and see whether it makes sense or whether there's elements of that could be incorporated into legislation. What this government has done is they've cherry-picked some elements of what we've been proposing, haven't gone as far as what we would have suggested, but on the other hand have taken the opportunity to make allegations against our leader and against our party and try to scare Nova Scotians from having an adult debate on Nova Scotia Power. And that's extremely unfortunate, especially for a party that spent its entire existence in opposition prior to the 2009 election, that now in government, that's how they would treat the opposition that's trying to bring forward ideas and bring forward positive suggestions on behalf of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I believe the government is seeing that their approach is not resonating with Nova Scotians and that they're being reminded on a regular basis that Nova Scotians expect better and that they're being attracted two responsible political parties that are putting ideas out there and that are having town hall meetings and having discussions on this matter. And you can tell just from the reaction of the government even on this discussion, the sensitivities that they do have around it, because on second reading I had the opportunity, I believe I quoted the current Minister of Health, not Health, but Finance, I should say. I apologize to the Minister of Health, but gave some of her quotes when she talked about power rate increases in the mid-2000s and the impact it was having on not only those that weren't working, but even on working families. And as I said on second reading, her comments back then still apply today. Yet for some reason, the government, now that's in office, has somehow forgotten about the impact that this is having on not only the poor, but on working Nova Scotians as well, who are having a hard time making ends meet. And rather than having an adult discussion about possible solutions, instead they've resorted to the approach of Chicken Little with the sky is falling approach and suggesting that power rates are going to increase by numbers they simply can't justify, but instead would try to scare Nova Scotians from believing that something can be done better to try to rein in power rates here in this province. One of the other things that I spoke about in second reading, which I'm still waiting for someone from the government to explain, was the letter that was submitted by Dan O'Connor, who's currently the Chief of Staff to the Premier, mere days before the 2009 election, where he suggested on behalf of the NDP that the Efficiency Nova Scotia charge should be paid by Nova Scotia Power shareholders and not ratepayers. I've yet to hear anyone on the government side, Minister of Agriculture, anyone else, explain why Dan O'Connor was wrong. Because obviously he had to be wrong because the government did the exact opposite of what was their position prior to 2009. So it's a fair question. I don't think anyone would say it's not a fair question to ask what changed. What was it that Dan O'Connor said on behalf of the party prior to 2000 election that no longer applies today? And I think Nova Scotians want to know that as well. And I think the government has ample opportunity to address that, because if there is legitimate reasons why that can no longer be done, that it's not a possibility, let's hear it. But rather than address that, the government and the minister, even again today, said the Liberals want to get rid of Efficiency Nova Scotia. He knows that's not true. Nova Scotians aren't buying it either. What we've said, basically, is exactly what Dan O'Connor said in 2009. Let the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power pay for this. In fact, I believe, again, the letter, I read it at length, actually argues it's in Nova Scotia's Power's best interest and on the bottom line for Efficiency Nova Scotia to work. And that's why he argued they should pay for it. Yet somehow something has changed and the NDP no longer support that position, but they're not prepared to tell us. But that's one of the main concerns that we have, and I think Nova Scotians have with this government, is they're not big on telling us much. Today, earlier in question period, I had the opportunity to ask the Premier, why won't you simply table the agreement you signed with IBM to take over the SAP function from the Department of Finance, so that Nova Scotians, not just members of the House, but Nova Scotians who are going to pay for this, over $100 million, can say, is it a good deal? Ironically, and I think we pointed out today, when in opposition, the NDP said that these types of discussions should be aired openly and that government should have to defend them prior to even entering into them. Yet we now know that this government has been in negotiations with IBM basically since the time they were elected. So 3 years they've had to tell Nova Scotians, here are the discussions. We're prepared to answer any concerns that you have. We're prepared to have a debate on this, and we want to make sure Nova Scotians are comfortable with the decision we're making. That, I would submit to you, is what a responsible government would have done. That, I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what the NDP asked when they were in opposition. Yet today, the Premier said, no, we're going to send it to the Freedom of Information Office so that it can follow the proper protocols. Again, this is a party that took the Freedom of Information Officer to court. They wanted more government information to be made available on behalf of Nova Scotians. Yet now that they're in government, they could simply table that agreement now so Nova Scotians can judge for themselves, that we can have an open debate on it. Instead, they simply throw back the criticism to us that you're against the deal. Well, it's hard to be for a deal that you don't really know what it is, other than what the government's prepared to share in their 1-minute answers in question period. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect more when you have a deal that's going to cost almost $100 million to taxpayers. The Premier today said that the cost is going to be neutral to taxpayers. But how do we know that? The Premier says that the cost, and the Minister of Finance says the cost was about $8.4 million a year. Yet we've yet to see a document brought in this House that shows that. So how can we say, yes, we agree, we've looked at it, and the numbers you've provided make sense. It is $8.4 million, so there's no added cost. You can't expect us, on behalf of Nova Scotians, as Her Majesty's loyal opposition, to sit there and endorse deals that we have no details. And I think the government knows that. And for some reason, they don't want to share that deal with Nova Scotians or with this House. And that veil of secrecy that's showing up more and more in this government is of concern to Nova Scotians. When we talk about power rates, my colleague spoke a bit about the deal with Newfoundland over Muskrat Falls. That is a deal that could have significant financial implications for this province. Within a mere month, the cost of that project increased by billions of dollars. Mere months. And we're still in the planning phases. Today in Newfoundland, a rigorous debate is trying to take place, yet the government of the day there is trying to do exactly what this government has done on so many other deals. They don't want to talk about it. And they don't want to justify it. Nova Scotians, I believe, Mr. Speaker, are open to any idea that's going to somehow lower power rates in this province or stabilize them. But they expect there to be an adult discussion where all of the details are put ahead of them. For this government to suggest that we should move forward and that the opposition should somehow endorse a plan that's going to cost potentially billions of dollars to Nova Scotians when we still have so many questions left unanswered is completely unreasonable. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. History of these mega projects in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada tend to go over budget. That's not new, and it's not a criticism of the existing government. It's happened under other administrations as well in every Atlantic province. So if there's anything we should do is learn from history and say, let's make sure this time around that we have as much information available to Nova Scotians, that we are entering into the best deal possible on behalf of taxpayers, and that we can say that Nova Scotians have a reasonable level of confidence that this is the right way to go. Instead, the government chooses not to share that type of information. So, Speaker, again, as I said, they've yet to explain to us why the position taken by Dan O'Connor prior to the last election is no longer policy of the NDP, and that it's not even a possibility to even look at it. Instead of having that debate, they accuse us of wanting to get rid of Efficiency Nova Scotia, which is simply not true, and they know that. Instead, when we talk about allowing independent power producers to sell directly to consumers, rather than having a discussion on that as well, they choose instead to just make these allegations and to say the sky's falling and it's the end of the world. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect better, because the NDP were in opposition and joined us after the 2005 electricity marketplace governance report, saying, why are we not allowing communities that want to build a wind turbine to be able to sell directly to their community? So let's have that discussion. But rather than have that discussion, the government turns around and says, oh, you want deregulation. The electricity marketplace governance report never suggested deregulation, and nor have we. But instead of having that adult discussion, the government's resorted to playground tactics of just trying to cause fear where there's no need. Unfortunately, I'm happy to report that all indications of testing the political winds of Nova Scotia